Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Sunday, April 25th, 2021, and today we're going to be taking a look at the 2022 United States House of Representatives elections because today, as of this morning, a generic ballot poll was released for the first time for the 2022 midterm elections. Now, I'm not so sure if you can tell from the voice, from my voice, but I am very, very, very excited to see this, which is going to signify the start of a number of polls that will be questioned amongst the American public that will allow me and allow you to understand where our nation currently stands ahead of 2022. And as of today, the NBC News Wall Street Journal poll released shows that the Democratic Party has started out with a 5-point advantage over the Republicans in the generic ballot. That means they've talked to voters around the country and asked, if the 2022 midterms were happening today, which way would you vote? Would you vote for the Republican in the House or the Democrat in the House, or potentially in the Senate? Essentially, this is the generic matchup between a traditional Democrat and a traditional Republican that gives us a general idea of what type of way this year is going to be, whether or not it's a red wave year, a blue wave year, or just a year that is for both parties. So 2022 generic ballot polls, we've not seen a single one the entire time after the 2020 election, and I am so excited to say today we officially have our first bit of data, which will be the first of potentially hundreds of polls taken amongst the American public pertaining to the 2022 congressional race. So let's do a little bit of history here before we get into the data, and before we talk about what this actually means for the Democratic Party if we are talking about what the data standing today, April 2021, a year and a half out from the midterm elections. Historically speaking, it won't tell us much, but it is interesting that we are just now getting data, and I think it's actually quite fascinating that the Democratic Party is starting out with the advantage because historically speaking, it makes sense, but we aren't exactly in a traditional type of midterm scenario where there's an unpopular president or an expected to be unpopular president because there is so much going on right now. We're in a global pandemic, and it's going to be a very different type of midterm season, just as 2020 was a very different presidential election. So let's go ahead and get started and talk about the generic ballot. Over the past few years, let's go start out with 2006, the last time the Democratic Party had a blue wave before 2018, and let's look at that generic ballot. Now, polling wasn't taken nearly as often as it is today, back in 2006, or really any year before 2008. When you start talking about horse race polling, yes, you had it, but there wasn't the facilities and the call centers and really everything ramped up to full capacity in order to take polls sometimes every single hour. For the 2020 election, we saw maybe 9, 10, 11 polls released every single day from different pollsters, sometimes with certain pollsters going into multiple states. We didn't see that happening back in 2006. There was Gallup, there were a couple of other main pollsters here, but the main thing was that it was just news media, just news companies, and that was pretty much it. There wasn't this number of pollsters from local areas and random pollsters around the country. But, looking at the generic ballot, we did get a general idea of who was going to win back in 2006. The Democrats were up on average by 11.5%. Now, that was certainly an overestimation. Part of the reason why I think is because CNN and Fox News had the Democrats up double digits, but then the polls right before, Pew Research, ABC News, USA Today, were much closer to the overall results. CNN actually had the Democrats up 20 points, which I found to be very interesting, and honestly just a miscalculation, very similarly to Newsweek putting them up 16 and Time putting them up 15. But overall, main thing is that the Democrats were leading in the generic ballot for the entirety of the polling. Now, if you look at the way that the generic ballot was taken over time, it was taken for a very similar length. The first generic ballot was actually taken back in December of 2004, and then into 2005, into 2006. So pretty much the data was taken pretty early on, back in 2004, not as much earlier than it was taken for 2022, largely because there was this whole backlash against polling firms after 2016 and 2020 that pollsters started to wait a few minutes and, wait a few months, actually, not minutes, wait a few months to actually do the poll, just so that way you're not getting immediate results right after an election, especially a hotly contested one for whatever reason. So in 2006, what we saw is that the Democratic Party was up for the majority of the time, but that's actually a very similar story that we see happen in almost every midterm election. In 2010, the Democratic Party started out with the advantage back in January 2009. Again, it is not historically There's no historical precedent for the midterm generic ballot polls to be taken this late into the game. We are seeing very few pollsters actually touch the 2022 midterms because they desperately do not want to be wrong. I mean, if you're looking at the data that was taken back in 2004, 2009, 2013, the reason for that is because, or early 2019, late 2012, is because the pollsters back then were more spot on. They were able to take data and they were more accurate in the past. Well, now, since we've seen a huge amount of the media and just pundit backlash towards polling firms, they've pushed themselves away from the generic ballot, more onto the President Biden approval rating and the questioning about certain major issues, for example, the infrastructure plan or the COVID-19 relief bill. But now we're going to start to see a bunch of them ramp up their midterm election data. But I think the reason why we held off and we didn't see many, or any actually, for months, was because they were afraid of being wrong, and they were afraid of them being the first pollster that could be so wrong in 2022. But looking at the generic ballot, like I had said, it's not hard to see how the Democrats were up back in 2009. The Democratic Party started out with an 11-point advantage over the GOP nationwide, ultimately ended up to lose by 7 points and were down 9 points on the national average. So the Democrats pretty much a net loss of 19 points nationwide, 20 points if you're rounding upwards. So the polls did start out with the Democratic Party ahead, but that's because they had just won in practically a landslide election. The Democratic Party was nearing 60 seats in the Senate, over 250 seats in the House, and won 67% of the entire amount of electoral votes in the 2008 election. It was truly put a modern landslide, not similar to Reagan or Nixon or FDR, but still something that we probably won't see for a couple of decades now, unless there's a widely popular candidate and a largely unpopular one. And while some people expected 2020 to be in a very similar fashion, I will say personally that I did think that the election would be more beneficial for Biden than it actually was. That was still an extreme scenario in order for Biden to even come to the realm of possibility of reaching Obama-like numbers, which is why it makes sense that the Democratic Party was up by such a high point, but they ultimately ended up losing. And the Republicans pulled ahead, was up 9 points on Election Day. And then if you go to 2014, it was a very similar tale. Polls that were taken immediately following Obama just being reelected back in November of 2012, so 2 months after, the Democrats started out with a 7, 5, 3, 4-point advantage nationwide. And that makes sense. Obama had just won a number of seats. The Democrats had 54 seats in the Senate. They had just won 332 electoral votes. For reference, Biden only won 306. So there was more of the American electorate in terms of electoral vote-wise that was probably with the Democratic Party and in the Senate. But Biden actually won a larger vote share. So the Democratic Party typically does better in early data, and it really depends on whether or not they hold out. Now, 2014 ultimately ended up being a very poor year because, number one, there was a miscalculation in the polling. If you look, Republicans won by 6. They were only up by 2, so that was an underestimation of their support. In addition, the Democratic Party actually was polling neck and neck with the Republicans for a very significant period of time. It was only in the final few months that the Republican Party really took away. In fact, back in the end of 2013, I think this was around the government shutdown, the Democratic Party really took away because of the unpopularity of the GOP. But by the time we reached 2014, well, they did a lot better. And then looking at 2018, 2018 was a year where the Democratic Party did phenomenal. In fact, the Republican Party never led on the generic ballot. And that's what I also want to point out. While the polls may sometimes show the Democrats ahead and the Republicans end up catching up, by the end of it, of course you will see how it ends up. But the GOP never once came really that close in terms of the generic ballot. The closest was when the Democrats were only up 3 points in 2018, but they were still leading nationwide. They ultimately ended up being up 7 points nationwide and ended up winning the generic vote by 8 points nationwide. So if you're looking at the generic congressional vote for 2018, the Democrats started out with the lead and never really lost it. And that's what we're going to be looking for 2022. We're going to be seeing how long the Democrats can actually hold off with the generic congressional vote. And if you're looking at non-midterm elections, well, 2020 is a perfect example. The Democrats were actually up by a very similar amount. Now, this is where it went horribly wrong for the Democratic Party. The Democrats were up with 49.9% of the vote to 42.6% of the vote. But then if you look at the actual results, this was supposed to be a 7.3% margin. Well, if you go down to the House results, it was 50.8 to 47.7. So you're talking about a difference of 3.1% rather than that 7.3% that was expected. And it was also more of a burn for the Democratic Party that in 2018, well, they were expected to do worse, actually, than what they actually did. They were expected to win by 7.3 and ended up winning by 8.4. Now, if we look at another presidential election year, I'm going to show you 2016. You might also notice that the generic ballot polling had the Democratic Party ahead for the entirety of the 2016 generic congressional vote. And I think this was largely due to the fact that Donald Trump was significantly underpolled and underrepresented in this data, not only in the Clinton v. Trump polls, but also in the generic ballot ones. But by the time we had reached the actual election, the Republicans were pulling ahead, making practically a skyrocket return, going from being down 6 to only being down by less than a percentage point. I mean, we're talking about a super significant increase here for the GOP. They went from 39% to 45%. So pretty much the GOP had a pretty significant increase back in 2016 that accounts for the sudden shift. But if you're looking at the data, the Democratic Party did start out with the advantage in 2016 and ultimately ended up losing by 1.1%. But I don't think it means much to talk about presidential elections. What we do need to talk about are midterm elections, because that's what 2022 is going to be. And if you're looking at the 2022 midterm elections, many people are expecting it to be, honestly, a Republican pickup in the House of Representatives. Based off the redistricting efforts from the GOP in statewide areas and, in local areas based off the 2020 elections, chances are the GOP will be the shoo-in for winning the control of the House of Representatives in 2022. Realistically speaking, the GOP has the advantage because the Democrats performed so poorly back in 2020. The House majority is the narrowest it has been since 2003. So if you're looking at the numbers, the Democrats are only 4 up more than what they need for control. And if you're looking at 2018, they did significantly worse. Yes, significantly worse than the Democratic Party did in 2018. And by almost every metric, we're expected to expand their majority. Because in almost every presidential election, besides 2020, and I think 2004 might be an exception, in recent political history, the Democratic Party almost always increases their House seats on a presidential level. When it's coinciding with a presidential election, the Democratic Party increases their seats. But that was certainly not the case in 2020 when the GOP flipped 15 seats. Wow, what an astonishing victory for the GOP. So the Democratic Party, I can understand, is worried for 2022. But I think that this generic congressional vote is sort of reaffirming what we have seen in previous midterm elections. The Democratic Party starts out with the advantage, and by around the middle of the midterm season, so in 5-6 months from now, we will get a general idea of which direction the country is actually going in. Now, we could be in for a surprise like we were back in 2014, where it was a year and a half of the Democratic Party being up, and then in the final 3 months, the GOP all of a sudden takes it away. 2022 could be like that, but we don't know yet. But this Democratic Party lead +5, while matching historical implications, we are not, historical midterm data, we are not in a traditional type of midterm election. We're talking about potentially another wave of mail-in voting, or the Joe Biden administration vaccinating 75% plus of the American public in order to return to a sense of normalcy, or return to reopening everything across the country and reaching herd immunity. Whatever it might be, there are a number of factors that were not factors back in 2018 or 2014 or 2010, 06, 02, 98, 94, 90, whatever it is, really. We had never seen a global pandemic in modern political history, and it's going to have a pretty significant effect on the outcome of the 2022 midterm elections. So the Democrats were worried about potentially being unpopular amongst the American public. They have no real reason to believe so. Joe Biden is popular. You cannot argue with me on that point. I'm using the numbers, and I'm telling you the numbers. As much as you might think personally he's not popular, you can't argue with the data. And if you're looking at the generic congressional vote, the reason why I trust it is because Donald Trump is not on this question. He's not on this questionnaire. President Trump isn't running for something in 2022. He's not on the ballot. So if you're looking at 2018, or really any midterm election where the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are just facing off against each other, any House election, any generic ballot, not necessarily a midterm one, because that sort of, wouldn't be possible for what I'm about to tell you, but whenever you're not really seeing Donald Trump on the ballot, well, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party sort of face off against each other as if there's no other factor impacting it. It's just a traditional standard D versus R race. There isn't this whole idea that if Trump is on the ballot and Trump is on the questionnaire, that the pollster might look at you a certain way, or you refuse to admit that you're voting for President Trump. No, this is a return to normal American politics of the standard Democrat versus Republican, which is why 2018 was so accurate despite 2020 not necessarily being accurate whatsoever. So when the Democratic Party was only a point and 1.1% off in 2018, but we're off by 4 points in 2020, I largely attribute that to President Trump. I also attribute the fact that 2016 was expected to go to the Democratic Party for the entire time, but since Donald Trump was on the ballot and there was a major miss on the statewide level, not so much on the national level, actually about a similar shift in favor of Trump on the national level. Clinton was expected to win by 3 points nationally. She won by 2. Democrats were expected to win by 0.6. Republicans won by 1. So I would say it's about, similar to what happened on the presidential level. The thing is, data is accurate, at least from what we've seen, when Trump isn't on the ballot. When Trump is not in the, under consideration for this, really, the data becomes much more accurate because people aren't afraid to say they're voting for a Republican. People are afraid to say they're voting for Donald Trump. When you tell people, I'm sure that you guys know this if you live in a majority Democratic area. I know I do here. People were very okay, and still are, with Governor Larry Hogan. He's a Republican. He did not vote for Biden. He did not vote for Clinton. He's a Republican in a completely Democratic area. My county gave Trump single digits in terms of the vote. Biden got 90% of the vote here. So the reaction when someone would say, I support President Trump, or I voted for President Trump, is much different than if someone says, I am a Republican, or I voted for Larry Hogan. You see, there's a big difference there. Donald Trump's name has become so polarized, and while politics almost always has been, Donald Trump takes it to another level. Because you've seen people vilified and scrutinized from many members of both parties for supporting either Biden or Trump. But when you remove all of that and you say, are you voting for a Democrat or are you voting for a Republican? There's a wide spectrum there, and people are going to be more honest because they are more comfortable. But I think we should be watching this 2022 data a lot closer just to see if there are any miscalculations or any major missteps by the time we reach the results. I'm hoping there are not. I personally do not believe that the data will be fundamentally flawed just because of the reason I just outlined for the past few minutes. But of course, I could be wrong. The Wall Street Journal could be wrong. NBC News could be wrong. But I just really was excited to make this video and really excited to cover the generic congressional vote over the next year and a half because this data will give us a general idea of where we're going. And I think that it also matches what we've seen in terms of the Biden approval rating. If people like the president, they're probably not going to vote against his party, at least yet. And also, we actually just got a poll for 2024 between a rematch of Donald Trump and Joe Biden, where Biden is actually up 4 points. So if he's up 4 points in a rematch and the Democrats are up 5 points, the math sort of checks out. Now, I don't think this data is 100% accurate. I don't think that it's something that will be really important to note right now because the election is 3.5 years away. But the midterm election data is just starting to ramp up and just starting to pour out. And I think we're going to see a number of midterm election polls released over the next few months, which should be very, very exciting. And will give us a general idea of what to expect leading into the 2022 primary season. And also, I was going to point this out, that Gallup has actually been doing polls for years now and asking the American public, where do you think, where do you personally stand between the Democrats and the Republicans? Do you like the Democrats more? Do you like the Republicans more? And one thing you might notice is that in midterm seasons, well, for example, right after Obama was elected, the Democratic Party dipped significantly. They went into 2008 with around 55% favorability rating, dipped down to 45%, actually below then 43% in terms of the approval rating. So from 55 down to 43, 12-point decrease right around time for the 2010 midterms, and the Republican Party won back control of the House and came pretty close in the United States Senate. Builds back up in time for 2012, and then it dips again in 2014. The Democrats don't necessarily lose to the Republicans in terms of favorability rating because the government shutdown took a big dip on the Republican Party's approval rating, but it did give us an idea, that the results wouldn't be nearly as favorable for Obama or his administration or the Democratic Party as they were in 2012 if their numbers went from 51 in 2012 all the way down to 42, 41. Fast forward to 2016, it gets about even there, and also, again, the Trump effect starts to take a massive impact, and then the Republican Party approval rating dips down to around 36%. The Democrats are still up, and then you go ahead and reach 2020, where surprisingly, the Republicans actually jumped up amongst the Democrats, and then right as the 2020 election hit, the numbers started to significantly decrease, and as of today, well, the Democratic Party has a 48% approval rating versus the Republican Party at 37%. So public sentiment shows the Democrats up 11 points. The generic ballot shows the Democrats up 5 points. There's no other way to spin this. I know I'm going to get a comment talking about how my video is being biased, my video is covering things that I shouldn't, but at the end of the day, I'm showing you the only poll that we have. If it shows the Democratic Party up, and if the approval rating shows Biden up, and if the Gallup poll shows the Democratic Party up, there's no real other news relating to this topic, other than the fact that the Democratic Party, in a sense, surprisingly, is doing, not surprisingly, at least for me, but I think for many people out there, because, midterm year, you always expect the opposition party to do better. But the main thing is that the Democratic Party is holding on for right now, and I think we need to watch it for the next couple of months to see how it actually pans out, and looking at it compared to Biden's approval rating, because generally you'll see them fluctuate very similarly, with there being a dip in the approval rating, a dip in the generic ballot support, whatever it might be. I think we should closely watch it over the next year and a half, because it will paint a very good picture for us of how 2022 will end up before the election results actually pour in. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2022 midterm election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.